Three. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mic'd in New Haven podcast. I believe it is episode 56. In that case, it might be the Lawrence Taylor episode of the Mic'd in New Haven podcast. I'm not sure. Hold the presses. It is episode 56. So this is going to be a very fun one. I'll be introducing my guest in a moment. But before I do, if you haven't checked out the previous episodes, it was a two-part special with retired NYPD detective first grade Irma Rivera, who worked infamous cases like the Lisa Steinberg case of 1987 and the Carnegie Deli murders of May 2001. She had a great 25-year career with the department, and she joined the show. So if you want to hear that interview, it's on my YouTube channel. It's also, of course, on everywhere that you get your podcast. She was fantastic. And we'll have more great guests coming up. Retired NYPD arson and explosion detective Bill Ryan on Monday. He investigated the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, of which today is the 28th anniversary of. And Tuesday of next week is retired NYPD bomb squad detective Dan McNally, who won a Medal of Valor for his heroic efforts at the World Trade Center on 9/11. And so some great guests coming up. But in between that, away from the law enforcement aspect of this podcast and now to the hockey aspect with my next guest, who's a man who's been embedded with the hockey community for over 45 years, a writer with a combined tenure of nearly 35 years with the New York Post. He's covered the Rangers for 25 seasons straight, going all the way back to 1996, and was covering them long before that, which we'll talk about with him throughout the show. Leaving the hockey beat in 1982 for a time, he spent a decade as an original member of the New Jersey Devils front office, serving first as their public relations director, and then as their vice president of communications until 1992, when he made his triumphant return to the New York Post, where he's been writing ever since. You can catch his Slap Shots column on the Rangers in the Post. It is Larry Brooks, and he joins me now on the Mic'd in New Haven podcast. Larry, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. I'm obviously part of an esteemed group of people you speak to, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Pleasure's all mine. We mix it up on the show. So it's a Swiss Army knife of podcasts. We mix, sports, news, law enforcement. So right. We're going back to the sports aspect of it today. So
I was actually selected for the jury pool of the 93 World Trade Center bombing.
Really?
Yeah, I was called to federal court, and there was a questionnaire you had to fill out. It was a long process, and I was actually selected for it. However, I ultimately dropped out along the way. It was interesting because I could not get an exemption, even though they said it could be up to a year of service. I didn't meet any of the requirements to be exempt from it. I actually got a letter from the paper and saying, look, this would be a hardship for us. Judge turned it down, so I was on it, and I went through a couple of voir dires and was either I don't remember actually whether it was the DA or the defense attorney who finally excused me, but I went through a number of sessions on it.
The guy that solved that case and risked his career to do so, I'm about to get his book because I spoke to him the other day for like an hour and a half over the phone. And the goal is to have him on the show as soon as I'm done reading his book. So you see, this is why I wanted to get you on. We're going to talk about hockey, and we're going to talk about stuff like that, details that I never even knew of. We learn right here on this podcast, folks. So interesting stuff off the bat. So I'll get to the first question, which is an easy one. And I asked this to all my guests, and that is, what was your childhood like? Where did you grow up, and what were your interests as a kid?
I grew up on the Upper West Side. I'm a boomer. I was born in 1950, so I'm right in that boomer class. Grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Went to Bronx Science for high school. Went to City College. So I am a New Yorker straight through. I have a sister. I guess I loved sports when I was growing up. I mean, that was a major part of the family life. My dad was a huge sports fan, a huge Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And so I got into sports, and I guess I like music, I like sports. I was a normal kid growing up in the 60s. I guess you could say I'm a child of the 60s. Everything that denotes, went to a lot of protest rallies, a lot of marches in the late 60s. Was part of the first lottery class for the draft, and I'm not talking about the hockey draft or the football draft or the baseball draft. I'm talking about the draft. I was part of the first lottery class, and I was number 365 in the lottery. So it was an amazing thing. So how they took you to go to Vietnam, how they drafted you.
Mm.
At first it was, if you were in school, you got a deferment. If you were a teacher, you got a deferment. But then they went to this lottery system where it just went by number. And I think the first maybe 1 through 100 or something were drafted, and I was 365. So I never faced the dilemma of what to do if I was drafted.
I think that is the last war which had a draft, because I think it was done away with following
Right.
that whole ordeal, which
Yep.
was mixed in with the Nixon administration and everything that went on there and all the craziness there of old, as Imus used to call him, Tricky Dick. So I'll ask you, when would it be fair to say, because you mentioned loving sports, but when would it be fair to say that you first developed an affinity or passion, if you will, for writing?
My dad actually was a writer in college, and then he served in World War II, and when he came back, he didn't go back to school. Um, I had actually some of his college newspapers that he wrote in, but I remember when I was 13, 14, 15, I would write art. I would take out my little typewriter and write articles after games, or and just do stories for myself. I also, of course, with friends, would pretend to host radio talk show, sports radio talk show, and we would one of us would be the host, the other would be the caller. We would switch. So but I didn't actually. I can't say that I planned to become a sports writer. I thought I kind of was on track to go to law school, but I didn't. And I got this opportunity. I had a friend who was working at the Post, and they were looking for a clerk to work overnight. And I had gotten out of school, and I didn't have a job. And this person asked me if I felt like coming in and doing it. And I thought it sounded great. Why not work in the sports department of the New York Post, work overnight. So I had my days free anyway. And it was a shift from, I think, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. And it was great. And it just went from there. I was able to write. I knew the subject matter, and I got an opportunity very, very early. I'd been there part-time for somewhere between 6 and 8 months when I got the shot to write. And my first assignment was to cover the Islanders. I got the Islander beat in 76, 77. That was my first assignment. So I've only worked for 2 companies in my life. You can say I've only been able to fool 2 companies in my life to hire me: the New York Post and the New Jersey Devils. So that's my entire resume. I was actually talking to a friend the other day, and she mentioned that she might be putting together a resume, and I said, "What does it say about me that I have never done a resume in my life? I just have never done a resume." So
It says that you're fortunate.
yeah, it says I'm fortunate. I agree. Yeah.
To fill those things out. Like I just turned 21, and I'm I'm in the process of filling that resume out right now. I already have, and I'm just looking for, it's basically like putting, the fish hook in the sea. Is there any biters? Especially now with the pandemic, it's difficult. So
Right.
the fact that you've dodged that, I tip my cap to you. I envy you, because it's not a fun thing. I mean, once you get the job, it's great, but when you're in the hunt, man, it's tough. So
Yeah.
you mentioned covering the Islanders, and I found that to be so interesting. Because this was before they commenced their dynasty. This was basically when they were getting off the ground as an expansion franchise. So at that point, they were on the come up. Players like Potvin and Gillies and Nystrom and Goring and Trottier were on their way. And of course, the late, great Al Arbor was their head coach. So you spent 3 seasons ultimately from 76 to 79, I believe, covering the Islanders. So that being said,
Actually, it was 2. I did
2.
76, 77, 77, 78.
Okay.
And then
came the Rangers.
When Hedberg and Nilsson signed with the Rangers, they asked me to move over to the Rangers. So I did 2 years of Islanders. actually then only 1 year of Rangers, and then I did hockey columns for the next until I left. So it was hockey columns 79, 80, 81, 82. No, 3 years.
So
I was gone 82. I was with the Devils. So I did 2 years of the Islanders, 1 year covering the Rangers, and then 3 years doing hockey columns, where I was around the Islanders all the time because they, I didn't travel much those 3 years. So I was doing both teams at home. And then whatever was going on in the playoffs, I would jump on the playoffs, and the Islanders won in 80, 81, and 82. So I was covering them during their first three cup runs.
So when you were covering them up front, I mean, what are the interactions looking back? Because I feel like that's the forgotten dynasty in sports, the Islanders 4 cups, 4 straight
Mhm.
cups. When people think about New York dynasties, I think the dynasty that comes to mind for most people would have to be pretty much any dynasty involving the Yankees, the most recent one being the late 90s dynasty.
Yeah.
But that one doesn't get enough attention. And so that being said, covering that team during that time, what are some of the interactions and memories behind the scenes, if any, that stick out most to you?
When I covered the Islanders, when I started with the Islanders, I was 26. And most of their players were between 22 and 25 or 26. So I was the same age as most of these guys. And there wasn't the disparity in income that there is now. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I was making then. I would say it was probably between 35 and 45,000 when I started. Um, and there were some players who weren't making a lot more than that back then. And so, there were no charters back then. Every team traveled commercial. The writers traveled with the team. It was kind of, it was a traveling party. And then after the games, we would go out with the players. It was just kind of a big group that hung out together. And of course, again, we were all the same age. At home, after just about every Saturday night game, we'd go to a spot right down the road from the Coliseum. It's called Dr. Generosity's, Dr. G's. Players would be with their wives or their girlfriends. Most of them were married actually at a pretty young age. And I would bring my then fiance, who became my wife, and so we would just hang out together. And I've told this story. I've written this before, but on the road after games, when I would go into the locker room, the first question, I'd go up to a player, and the first question had nothing to do with the game. The first question was, "Where are we going?" So it was such a different world. I mean, there is no interaction now between media and players away from the rink, away from the field, at least as far as I know. There is essentially none now. And pre-COVID, I'm talking about the
Of course,
last
yeah.
few years, because there's just a dividing line now, and the players are different. They're training after games. I used to go back into the Islander locker room when I started. They had 2 rooms, the Islander room, one in which they had their hockey equipment. They got into their uniforms, got in and out of their uniforms, and they had a back room where they got where the showers were and all. And when I started, the Post was a PM paper, which meant my deadline essentially was 5 in the morning. So I didn't have to write immediately after the game. I could take as much time as I needed. And I would go in and sit in the back of the Islander locker room and just talk to these guys like for an hour. They would be in the back drinking beer. I'd be drinking beer. It was a different world. And so the relationships I had with the Islander players were real, and they were deep, and there was a mutual friendship, even though I was covering them. And ultimately there was a line, but it was a line that the players and I were very comfortable drawing. Now, again, it's just a professional relationship. You go into the locker room, you're there for a very short time. There's so much more media now that um, generally players do their post-game interviews in scrums. There are 6, 8, 12 people around them. It's hard to talk to guys one-on-one. So it's a different world. And I'm not sure that I would have, well, I know that I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much doing it now. I'm not sure that I would have stayed with it if the conditions now had been the conditions when I started, because it was just a blast. I mean, honestly, it was just a
It sounds
blast.
like it. It sounds like it. Like, you know, when I listen back, I listened to the Sports Reporters podcast, which is they revived it in a podcast form of course, the iconic ESPN show.
Mhm,
And Mike Lupica talks a lot about that. So does Mitch
mhm.
Albom, Bob Ryan, you know, just the
Yeah,
closeness with the players and the
yeah.
fact that, you know, this was during a time when the sports writer in any given paper, especially in the major markets, had a lot of say, had a lot of sway. I mean, Dick Young comes to mind, Lupica comes to mind. You know, Pete Hamill didn't write about sports that much, but whenever he did, obviously people paid attention. So it really, you know, it's a throwback not only to a bygone era in sports, but a bygone era in New York. You know, it's New York during the '70s, especially during these times with the Islanders and the come up and the Rangers, which I'll talk about in a moment. Just a really interesting place to be. So 1978, 79, as you
Mhm.
said earlier, is when you covered the Rangers and you picked a heck of a time because they made the Stanley Cup final this season.
Right,
And you
right.
mentioned some of the players that they brought in earlier. I think Phil Esposito was there by this point.
Mhm.
Ron Duguay, John Davidson was playing goal for them.
Right.
So, you know, covering that team during that time, I don't think we touched on why you switched over. Well, no, we did actually when they brought in the free agents. We did touch on that. But how do you think? I mean, you covered 1994, which we'll talk about later. But that team and their run to the Cup final, which they ultimately lost to Montreal in five, how did that run captivate New York City?
Oh, they were a big time team. Let me tell you, they had a lot of charisma. That was the Ooh La La Sassoon range. They did spots for Sassoon jeans, and they made like a hockey, what was it called, hockey sock or hockey rock. They cut a 45. They cut a record. Both Maloney's, I think, Dave and Don, maybe Greshner, Espo. That was a charismatic team. They hung out, or certainly Duguay did, and he wasn't alone. They hung out at Studio 54, and they played the Islanders in the semifinals that year, the Cup semifinals. The Islanders had finished first overall in the NHL, with the best record in the NHL. The Rangers had finished, maybe sixth or seventh in the league. They had a good season, a good team, but they weren't regarded necessarily as a cup contender.
Mhm.
And that 6-game series, the Rangers beat the Islanders in six that year, and it was on the front page every day. It was massive. The Ranger Islander series of '79, except maybe the Rangers Devils series in '94, and then the Rangers finals in '94 were probably the two biggest um, hockey NHL series ever played in New York. But the '78-'79 series was really close. That was a very, very popular team, a very good team. And so it was great covering them too, because they also had a lot of young guys on the team, and who I became friendly with pretty quickly, and we would spend some time together away from the rink. So that was a really fun experience covering that team.
Longtime New York Post hockey columnist and a Hockey Hall of Famer, Larry Brooks, is my guest here on the Mike and David podcast. Nice enough for him to join us this week. So, you know, this was really the beginning of the apex of the Rangers Islanders rivalry because, you know, it's interesting for me growing up a Rangers fan, watching them since '06. I've never really hated the Islanders, to be honest
Mhm.
with you. It's kind of, I view them in the same vein I view the Mets. Yeah, is it nice to beat them when you play them? Yeah, but I don't wish anything ill upon them. I want to see them do well otherwise. It's not like the Devils, you know, because I still hate Adam Enrique to this day. To this day, it still hurts my soul. But, you know, the Rangers got through the Islanders that season. And then the Islanders on their subsequent cup runs went through the Rangers a couple of times.
Mhm.
So that rivalry, the hatred, the intensity amongst the fan bases, obviously amongst the players, was there, and it was raw and it was real. So that being said, being there for that era of the rivalry, how did you view it then? How do you view it now, looking back?
Well, the game was so much different then, that there was visceral hatred between teams. And it wasn't only the Rangers and Islanders, it was the Rangers and Flyers. It
Yeah.
was the Islanders and Flyers. Uh, because the games were so physical, that there were feuds. You knew going into any game there was likely to be a brawl, series of brawls. And so rivalries were much, much more intense back then. There's no comparison to the way it is now. It's an antiseptic league now.
Yeah.
More skill. There's no question that there's more skill. I'm not sure it's more entertaining. It's certainly more evolved. I mean, no one would stand for bench clearing brawls now. No one would stand for it. People would just walk out of the arena. They wouldn't be a sport. So the evolution of the sport was necessary, but I'm not quite sure that they're the same emotions that were so central to all of these rivalries are missing now, because it's all skill, just play, 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 play. There's less hitting now. There's obviously, very few fights in games, which is understandable. But when comparing one era to the next, you have to start with that. Then, the Rangers and Islanders have so rarely been good at the same time over the last 20, 25 years, whatever it is. They haven't played in a late round matchup in forever. They actually haven't played. When was the last time they even played in the playoffs?
1994, the first round.
Yeah. Okay. Right. That was it. So they haven't played in forever. So the Ranger Islander rivalry now is more of a fan rivalry than it is a team rivalry. If they're both real good and they're both competing for the cup, then I'm sure it'll ratchet up again. That's the way it is.
We almost got a second round matchup between them in 2015. That was when the Islanders took the Capitals 7. The Capitals won out, and they were the better team. And the Rangers, of course, went on to have a great series with the Capitals, which ended on a step-on overtime Game 7 winner. So we've come close. But the thing is, the last time the Rangers, Devils, and Islanders were in the playoffs at the same time, I think you have to go back to 2007, if I'm not mistaken, that all three teams were in the cup playoff. Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of, I mentioned the Yankee Met comparison earlier. It's the same thing with them. Like, except for a little period in the late 90s, both of them have never been good at the same time. It's funny how that works. But
the Rangers Devils had the 2012 one where the Devils shocked the Rangers in the conference finals, where
remind me.
It was actually 18 years, I think, to the day of either Game 6 or Game 7.
Game 6, the Messier guarantee.
Right. So it was 18 years to the day. And what was so remarkable about that was 18 years later, there was Martin Brodeur. There was Brodeur 18 years later, twisting history his way. It was remarkable. His run in 2012 was spectacular. Honestly, it was spectacular. And I maintained that if Kovalchuk had not been hurt in the finals, that the Devils would have beaten the Kings. I thought they would have won. They lost the first two games in overtime at home. Kovalchuk was basically playing on one leg.
Yeah.
I thought they would have won. But that was really one of the rare times where a team winning the conference finals and then losing in the cup final. Losing the cup final almost seemed secondary that year for the Devils because they had knocked off the Rangers. And in such a massive upset with Brodeur actually outplaying Lundqvist in that series. And it was a fascinating series.
I don't think I talked to anybody for 3 days after Game 6, except for my mom. That loss, my teams are the Yankees, Knicks, Giants, and Rangers. The only loss that hurt worse, two losses hurt worse than that one. Game 5, 2014, Alec Martinez. And then the ALCS where Chapman gave up the home run to Altuve. Those two losses are the ones that probably are on the same level. But that loss was devastating, man, you know what? Tipping my cap in retrospect, I always felt up until that playoff run that Brodeur was the beneficiary of having two Hall of Fame defensemen in front of him and a really good defenseman in Scott Stevens, Scott Niedermayer, Hall of Famers, and then Ken Danico. But, neither of those guys were there for that run. And for him to do that with a defensive core that wasn't bad, but wasn't to the level that those 90s, 2000s teams were, it's a testament to Marty's greatness, which I begrudgingly acknowledge. But, accelerating to 1982. That's when you left to go work in the New Jersey Devils front office. They were the Colorado Rockies, and then they became the New Jersey Devils. So you mentioned when they were interviewing you a few years ago, getting your thoughts on your Hall of Fame induction, that you took the job because you pretty much ran out of things to write in your mind. And I'm wondering, I'm like, the Islanders are in the middle of this dynasty. The Rangers are still pretty good. What do you mean you ran out of things to write?
Oh, I don't know if I thought I think I thought that I pretty much had written everything there was to write, and yeah, but I also had the chance to move into a hockey front office, and I thought that would be an interesting move for me. But it's true. I do remember thinking back then, well, how much more can I write? I've already written for 6 years. It's funny. I did think that.
It's interesting because, you were John Delapina before John Delapina. John Delapina covered the Rangers many years for the Daily News, and now he's a big shot in the NHL, I think, PR division.
Right.
So you were a trendsetter in that regard. And Billy McMillan, who was the GM at the time, he offered you the job when you took it. I'm curious because I don't know when print journalism started to experience this ongoing decline. A lot of people say the early 90s. I don't know if it extends farther back than that. Were you seeing that at the time? And
no.
It was still pretty good?
No, I would say, without doing any research on it and just responding to this question, I would say that print journalism probably didn't start to decline until somewhere in the mid 2000s.
Okay.
Because as I remember it, the internet did not become a force until somewhere in the early to mid 2000s, because back in the late 90s, I think that there were, you couldn't find everything on the internet. Most papers did not make their entire inventory available on the internet. So I don't think it was until the mid 2000s. I could be wrong. I'm not, it's just anecdotally as I think about it. I don't think it was until the mid to late 2000s.
Yeah, that's the good thing about it now is, when you post a column on Twitter, is that, you get that instantaneous reader feedback. The bad thing about it is that you get that instantaneous reader feedback. Like the other day, without diving too much into it, that Tony D'Angelo column, which as a neutral party with no perspective on either way, I read the column and I thought, okay, you did what you're supposed to do. He gave the guy a chance to tell his side of the story, and he told it. And, anybody who agrees with him can agree with him. Anybody who disagrees with him can disagree with him, but it's there and you can decipher for yourself. And then I checked the Twitter mentions, and it wasn't pretty. So it's got its good and it's got its bad. So, when you got to the Devils front office, they struggled in their early years. Of course, this was long before Stevens, Niedermeyer, Brodeur, and Elias got there and really legitimized the franchise in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. So originally, as I mentioned, when I was introducing you, you were their PR director then. And besides the worst thing, I can't talk now. The worst thing that can befall a bad team is apathy, when fans just stop caring. So working in PR at the time, what were you trying to do to keep the fans engaged with the Devils?
Well, we were trying to develop a fan base. And what was so attractive to me was that it was a new team and that I could go in and basically establish the PR department the way I wanted it to run. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't walking into an established situation where the job had already been defined. I could define the job and the way we were going to operate. And it was a very, very small operation the first couple of years. I mean, we may have had fewer than 20 or fewer than 15 full-time employees in the front office, something like that. I'm not counting the scouts and all and that. I'm saying aside from the hockey operations, the marketing and the finance and PR, and it was just a very, very small group. We had margarita parties every Friday. It was fantastic during the off season, not during the season.
Allegedly.
Yeah, we did. We had. I mean, it was just great. The ticket department, we really had a lot of fun. And so our objective was to build the Devils as a brand. And I don't know if anyone used the word brand back in 1982. But to build the Devils as as a franchise, and to create a fan base. And it was interesting too, because when John McMullen bought the Rockies and moved them to New Jersey, there had been a pre-existing list of people who had inquired about season tickets. However, these were people who thought that the Rangers might move from the Garden to New Jersey, because back in the late 70s, there was that threat. In early 80s, that the Garden, the Rangers and Knicks were going to move to the Meadowlands.
Could you imagine? Wow.
It was a tax issue. They were trying to leverage their business interests. So they had the Meadowlands to use as as a threat. They were going. So people had sent inquiries about season tickets, and there was a massive list of people interested in buying season tickets. However, they were interested in buying season tickets for the Rangers. And that I think that was a rude awakening for some people. I didn't actually come until August that year, actually. But people had been working there for a couple of months, and you know what, we did well. I mean, we did well. We had a strong base. I think our average attendance was between 12 and 15,000 the first few years, when it was just a really bad team. And I always thought back then that the problem with the Meadowlands, which was a beautiful building and was new, the problem was that it could seat 19,000 people. So there was never urgency for people to buy season tickets. You could always walk up the day of the game and buy a ticket. And I had a lot to do with the pricing, and there were so few people working in the organization that we all were working on ticket sales and strategies to sell tickets. And so it was difficult to create urgency for people to buy season tickets, because there were always going to be seats available on the day of the game, and you never want to rely on day of game gate sale, because it can be affected by the weather. It can be affected by your team's on a losing streak, your best player is injured, or the opposition's best player is injured. So you never want to be reliant on selling tickets on a game day. And I always believed that our attendance would have been higher. We would have sold more season tickets if the Meadowlands had a capacity of, say, 17,000 or 16,006 instead of 19,000. The year they went to the semifinals in 87, 88, went to the seventh game of the semifinals. That was the year Devils made the playoffs on the final day of the season, and then beat the Islanders in the first round, beat Washington in the second round, and then took Boston to 7 games in the third round. The next year, I think our average attendance was something like 17,700, or almost 18,000.
Winning cures a lot.
So success is always I remember going to marketing meetings. I would go to these league marketing meetings. And this was in the first few years, and our attendance was probably 13,000, 14,000, somewhere around there, in a 19,000 seat building. So, there always were empty seats. There always a lot of empty seats. And I remember we would have these marketing meetings, and the marketing director from the Flyers, just an arrogant person, would try and explain what we were doing wrong. And the guy from Calgary, also a very arrogant fellow, would get up and try and explain what we were doing wrong. Meanwhile, they were coming off Stanley Cup victories. They had been to the finals 3 times in 5 years. It's, you can devise strategies, and certainly there are people who are much better at it than other people, and teams come up with strategies that are maybe more productive than others. But it always comes. 99% of it is dependent upon your team. If you have a good team, you're going to sell tickets.
Right.
unless you're
Yeah.
doing something wrong or your pricing is so out of whack. If you have a good team, you're going to sell tickets. And so, I remember just sitting there, looking at these guys and thinking, come on, man. You know,
Sometimes it's not even that. Sometimes if you just have good players, like for example, the Rangers in the late, like after 1997 to 2004, they sucked. Like they were awful, but they had Messier and they had, well, Gretzky at the end of his career. They had
right.
Lindros and Bure and Fleury. So at least, even that, even though it's much better to
Mhm.
be good and competitive,
Right.
even that, just it helps sell tickets. So, that I do want to make a note of this. You also dabbled in play-by-play for a few seasons there as well, which I
Oh,
find
I didn't do
interesting.
play-by-play. I was a
Yeah.
color
Oh,
analyst.
you were
I
color.
didn't,
Well,
didn't do
you worked in
play-by-play.
the booth, is what I'm
I
getting at.
did. I
Yeah.
did.
One guy was Dale Arnold, who's been up in. I used to call Dale Arnold actually on his show.
Yeah.
He's been up in Boston WEI forever. And another
Mhm.
guy is Chris Moore, who I also
Right.
used to call. He's been with WFAN forever.
Right.
So, what did you enjoy most about being in the booth, and what did working with two seasoned pros like that teach you about, well, being in the booth?
Uh, well, it was fun. It was just fun to talk about the game. Also, it was fun, because I had come from obviously the writing background. It was also fun that when the game was over, my job was done too. I didn't have to start working after the game was over.
Right.
Uh, um, no, I just had a great time doing it. Dale 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 came, and I believe, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was his first NHL job. I think he came from the Maine Mariners, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, he
So he had
did.
been doing play-by-play for the Maine Mariners of the American League, and he was a button-down, pro from the first game. I worked with him. Chris, different kind of personality, just a fun guy. Um, he had come from the University of Wisconsin, so it was his first year. I had done 1 year with Dale, and then Chris came. I drove Dale, I drove Dale out of the booth after 1 year, and then Chris came, and we just had a great time together. I loved with it was just 3 hours of kind of friends talking about a hockey game as was going on. That's the way I looked at it. I never considered that I was going to have a long career in broadcasting. Although, there were times I actually filled in for John Sterling on his talk show a number of times. I was a substitute host for him. Even earlier than that, I had filled in for Art Russ Jr. when he had a talk show back in New York. So I had a fair amount of experience doing radio talk, and I think it's something I could do. I think it's something I was reasonably good at, but I did enjoy writing more than I enjoyed talking.
Well, you mentioned John Sterling. The day I was telling, it's funny you mentioned because I told this to a buddy of mine last night as we were talking about spring training. The day that man retires, I'm going to be really sad,
Yeah.
because he's my childhood. And he's getting up there, but he's still, he's hanging on. He's still around. So, is there a particular game from that time in the booth that sticks out that was really fun to call? Just a great like overtime thriller from the regular season? Anything that you can remember?
Well, the final game of the 88, 87, 88 season, when the Devils were in Chicago and they needed the Rangers to lose, and the Rangers started a half hour before, or an hour maybe before the Devils did. So the Ranger game was over. Oh no, I'm sorry. If the Devils won, they were in regardless. If the Devils won their game, they were in regardless. And the Rangers had started earlier and they won. So if the Devils had lost, they were going to be out. And Devils were losing the game in the third period, tied it up in the third period, won in overtime, and that's probably the most memorable. Um, that's the most memorable game that I broadcast. It was, to make the playoffs for the first time, to do it in that kind of dramatic setting was pretty special. And then doing the playoffs that year was great too. Upsetting the Islanders in the first round. The Islanders had finished first place, then beating Washington in seven. They won 3 games in Washington, and that was also the year that the coach Jim Schoenfeld had been suspended, and we had the incident on the Sunday where the refs struck and they used amateur referees to do the game. It was called Yellow Sunday,
Mhm.
And so I was doing the color, but I was also the PR person. And so I was going like from the booth down to read a statement. And then I actually nearly got disciplined by the NHL because I spent, I think, like an hour just an hour just criticizing the way the NHL had handled the entire thing. And the next day I was told that at a hearing that there had been some sentiment that I should be fined, but the owner stepped in for me and said, don't worry about it.
He did you a solid, which is nice of him. You're just speaking your mind. It's interesting. You got to see both sides. You got to see obviously how covering a team works, and
Mm-hmm.
then you got to work on the inside and see it from that perspective. So I'm curious, and we'll talk about your return to writing in just a moment. We'll dive deeper into it in just a moment. But having worked for a decade in a front office, and then obviously all your years combined writing at the Post, how has that experience affected your approach or altered your approach, if at all, to how you cover the Rangers now and act number 2 with the Post?
Well, I know generally how things work inside teams' front offices, which most writers don't because they've never been there.
Right.
And listen, I understand that a hockey front office in 1990 was prehistoric compared to the way teams are run now. But the same principles apply. And so there are so many more factors that come into play when decisions are made than the superficial ones that the public generally is aware of. And at the same time, even though I I'm not going to write every day. Listen, there are things I don't know, but I recognize that even when you're there every day, you can't know everything that's going on because it's hidden from you, and there's just so much under the surface that goes on every day that you're not aware of. So I try and keep that in mind when things happen that seem to make no sense. I recognize that there's probably a reason for it, even though I might not understand it or might not be aware of it. Um, you know, there is just so much more that goes into every element of running a team than people on the outside recognize, and of course because they're not there. So those are probably the advantages I think I might have from having worked in a front office. But again, it was so long ago, and things are so different now that I'm not sure it lines up one to one.
Has to have paid some kind of dividends though here and there, especially now. The Rangers have had a lot going on in the news lately. I mentioned the D'Angelo thing, obviously now that there's the well-known Artemi Panarin situation. So I imagine that even though obviously, as you said, yeah, the way teams are run now has changed dramatically in the last 3 decades. There's still some muscle memory there. There's still the basics that front offices keep that will never go away. So I imagine that it's had to have helped. So it's interesting. We talked about earlier when you were talking about being a juror for the 93 Trade Center bombing case, that it was around this time that you came back to the New York Post after a decade working for the New Jersey Devils. So you ran out of things to write. That's why you went over to the New Jersey Devils front office. Did you run out of things to do in the PR office? Is that why you came back to the
No,
Post?
no, it was.
I'm just teasing you.
I think no, it was just time for me to. It was time for me to go. It was time for me to go.
Did they offer that? Did the Post offer you the opportunity to come back? Did you reach out to somebody to come back?
It's very interesting. I had actually left the Devils, and there had been a gap between me leaving the Devils and me going back to the Post. And Mark Everson, who had been there for a long time at the Post, had been there for a long time, um, called me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in coming back? Because we're looking for a guy." And I said, "Yeah, I would." And so that's how it developed. And the sports editor then I hadn't worked for. The sports editor at the Post when I came back was a fellow named Bob Decker. And I had no experience with Bob, but I think we had a perfunctory interview, and I was rehired. Within it couldn't have been more than 2 weeks. It might have been 1 week. He was gone. He was out, and Greg Gallo, who had actually been there before when I was there, had come back, and I told Bob, I hope I hope it wasn't the decision to bring me back to get him in, but. So I came back in the middle of the 93-94 season. I was covering, and I was covering the Devils, which was a very interesting dynamic since I was now covering guys I had known from the organization when I worked for them. So it was comfortable in some ways, and it was challenging in other ways.
Mhm.
There was a new coach, Jacques Lemaire was there. He wasn't there when I had been there before. So there were some new guys, but there were a lot of older guys there who I had known, and so I covered the Devils for a couple of years when I came back before I went back to the Rangers.
But as you said, this was an interesting dynamic, not just because of the fact that you were covering guys that you used to, deal with working in the PR department, of course, communications in general for the Devils, but this was when the team really started to take off and become a legitimized franchise. I mentioned Stevens, Niedermeyer, Danico, and Brodeur. Elias would get there a few years later, but Bruce Driver was there. Tommy Ablin was there. Stefan Richer was there. And the Rangers, after having missed the playoffs in 93, regrouped. They brought half the Edmonton Oilers with them to New York, granted, but they regrouped with a great team of Messier, Leach, Richter, and Graves, and other guys like Buka Boom and Glenn Anderson and Kovalev chipping in. And then, of course, we got, I think, one of the greatest springs in the history of New York City, where obviously the Knicks made their run to the NBA Finals and the Rangers made their run to the Stanley Cup Finals. They blew the doors off the Islanders. They pretty much blew the doors off the Capitals in the second round. The Devils got through Ray Bourque and the Bruins and got through a great 7-game series against Hasek Sabres, which sets up this iconic, one of the greatest playoff series, not just in the history of hockey, but in the history of sports, that 7-game epic with the Devils. Take me through covering that series and, of course, the Stanley Cup final with the Rangers and the Canucks. I know you were working the Devils beat then, so you maybe didn't cover the Stanley Cup finals as much, but that conference finals between the Devils and the Rangers, take me through it.
Well, I thought the Devils that year had the second best record in the NHL. They were a big time team. They had, as you mentioned, some of their guys they had Richer, they had Claude Lemieux, they had Bobby Carpenter, John McClain was a veteran.
Bobby Halik.
Sorry?
Bobby Halik as well.
Right. Bobby Halik. But they had a big time team, but they were young. And this was their first real crack at it. And what was interesting was the Rangers finished that year with 112 points, finished with the best record in the league. The Devils finished with 106, second best record in the league. And the Rangers had beaten the Devils 6 out of 6 during the regular season. So that was the difference between the teams. And I think Brodeur started 4 of the 6 games, and he was pulled in each one. He didn't finish a game against the Rangers that year. But the way the Devils played, I thought they were going to win the series. I thought they had a great shot to win the series. They come into the Garden for game 1. They win in overtime. Richer scored in overtime. Second game, Messier puts down Stevens on his pants on the first shift. I can see it because we used to sit in the Garden right above the Zamboni entrance, so way down, right down above the ice. It was incredible when the puck was in that end of the ice. When the puck was in the other end of the ice, it was not, it wasn't great because it was tough to see, but you could feel the emotion. You could feel the speed of the game when you were down there. And honestly, that check of Messier on Stevens, I mean, it seems like it happened yesterday. I can just recall it. And
he sent him flying. It's on YouTube. I've seen it. And Scott Stevens is one of the greatest hitters the game has ever seen. He got his there.
Right. So the Rangers, infused by confidence, maybe from that hit, from whatever, they win a pretty routine game 2. We go back to the Meadowlands for the third game. Rangers win in overtime. Matteau scores.
Mhm.
And then games 4 and 5, the Devils dominated. They dominated each game. And they were by far the better team. And all this crazy stuff was going on the Rangers side with with Mike Keenan, and he had pulled Richter from game 4. He had benched Leach from a game. He then had called the beat writers into a meeting and wanted to go off the record for the entire thing, and revealed a couple of injuries, and it was not kept off the record. But there was all this stuff going on the Rangers side, and the Devils were just going about their business. They didn't say much, you know. Lou Lamoriello was the GM. He doesn't say much. I mean, that's the character of the team, the personality of the team. And so the Devils are up 3-2. And I lived in Westchester. And back then I lived about 15 minutes away from Playland, which is where the Rangers practiced. And Mark Everson, who covered the Rangers, lived in New Jersey. So for whatever reason that day, the office assigned us to stay basically at home. So Mark covered the Devils on the practice day, and I was covering the Rangers. So I was covering it when Messier made his will win guarantee, his guarantee. And and I have to tell you this, that when he said it, it's not as if he made a proclamation. It's not as if he went to his locker, stood up and said, guys, I have an announcement to make. We're going to win tomorrow night. It was in the course of conversation. We're going to win. We're going to win. And I didn't lead with it. I know I didn't. I think I put it in the 4th or 5th graph. But the back page was, yes, we'll win tonight. It is the most famous back page in our history. You see it all the time. Captain Courageous.
Yep.
We'll win tonight. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And so it became, it became massive, to the point where now it appeared as if he was making a Joe Namath guarantee. And even Namath was, I guarantee it. Mark didn't say that. He said, we'll win, which, what else was he really going to say? So on the morning of game 6, so this is on the back page now, and the Daily News also had something, but not something quite as dramatic. And so I was covering, so the morning of game 6, I went to South Mountain Arena where the Devils skated. And you could see that the Devils were upset. And I remember going over to Stevens and saying to him, well, do you have anything to say? I mean, do you have a guarantee for tonight, or whatever? And he just looked and said, we do our talking on the ice. All right. So they go out. This is now game 6, and the Devils dominated the first 35 minutes of the game. They're up 2-0 in the first. By the middle of the second, it could have been 7-0. They dominated the game. It was maybe the best game of Mike Richter's career. He alone held the Rangers in.
Stood on his head.
But it was a blowout. It was just a blowout, and you could see the Rangers. The Rangers were nervous. The Rangers were falling apart. But late in the second period, they scored a goal. Kovalev scored late in the second period to make it 2-1, and the entire dynamic shifted. What I was to learn later was, between periods, in the locker room, the Devils were completely out of control. They were panicky. It was a situation where they just were not experienced enough to handle it, being 20 minutes away from pulling this off. Whereas the Rangers, a real veteran team, like all these cup winners from Edmonton, a veteran team was in its element, and Messier was in his element. And so then they go out in the third period, and Messier scores, and it's 2-2, and Messier scores, and it's 3-2. and Messier scores in the empty net. It's 4-2. But for 35 minutes, the Devils had dominated that game, and had they, had they scored, had they made it 3-0, they probably would have won the game, 6-0, 7-0, because the Rangers were teetering on the edge. And to think of what might have happened, Neil Smith probably would have been fired. Keenan probably would have been fired. Messier might have been traded, because remember, the Rangers had gone through an Islander dynasty. And here now were the Devils. And suddenly the Devils were going to beat them. So the entire history of the Rangers would have changed had they not won that game. And it's one of the most memorable games I've ever covered. I remember writing after the game, maybe 1,500 words or 2,000 words, and usually a game story maybe was 700 or 800 words, and I just went on and on and on. And it jumped, the jump would continue. You never see this in papers anymore, but where you run the story on one page and then would continue on another page, and that, you call it jump, it would jump to another page. And, it took up an entire page. It was one of the most memorable games I've ever covered. But 2 nights later, Game 7.
Before you get to Game 7, I don't want to stop. I don't mean to stop you, but
yeah.
I just want the audience that's going to watch this on YouTube to see the hit that Messier did on Stevens. And I have to mute it because it's playing Metallica's Enter Sandman. And if you know the history of Metallica, they like to get their money. So here is the hit from Game 2.
Yeah, right. There it was.
Leveled them.
Yeah. Absolutely
leveled them. It's one of the best hits, I think, that we've ever seen in sports. So as you were saying, Game 7.
So I'm saying Game 7. This is 2 nights later. It was, I think, the best played high stakes hockey game, perhaps in history, or in Stanley Cup history. I know there are a couple of great international games, but I'm not sure that there's ever been a winner-take-all game that it was played to this level. The Kings and Blackhawks played a spectacular Game 7 of their conference finals in 2015. Or was it 2014? Might have been 2014, 14 or 15. I think they played both years. But the 7-game series, one of those years was spectacular. There were 2 or 3 overtimes in the series. And Game 7 was back and forth game, when either overtime or double overtime. Mm-hmm. But this game was so well played, which the Devils down 1-0. Brian Leetch scored one of the great goals ever. He did a spinorama on Billy Guerin, and kind of stuffed it in on Brodeur in the second period. So it stays 1-0. And here are the Devils down 1-0 in an elimination game, and they just kept rolling their 4 lines, because this is what they did. They just kept rolling their lines and rolling their lines and rolling their lines, and they finally they tie the game with 7.7 seconds left in the third period, and the Garden went from jubilation to silence in like that, and there was just dread was permeating the arena during the intermission, during the next overtime. The Rangers carried the play in the overtime. Brodeur was terrific. Devils had 1 or 2 pretty good chances, but the Rangers sort of took it over, and then obviously they won it in the second overtime. It was as memorable a hockey series, I'm sure, as I'll ever cover, and certainly the best one I've ever covered.
Talking with Larry Brooks here on the Mike New Haven podcast. Yeah, I mean, there's a sequence, because that game in its entirety is on YouTube, and I've seen the game, during this pandemic when you have time to kill, and who does it these days? I've watched the entire game, and it was Zelepukin that scored with 7.7 seconds left. 2 things that stand out from my observation of it objectively, because I didn't live it in real time. I wish I did. But Mike Richter has a reputation as being a really mellow, down-to-earth, cool guy. When Zelepukin scored that goal, I don't think I've ever seen him so angry. I mean, he was right in the ref's face, just screaming that it was interference. He lost it, and I don't blame him. It's a high stakes situation, but that goes to show that even a mellow guy like Richter, for him to lose his cool like that, it spoke to the intensity of the moment. And right before Mateau scored his legendary wraparound on Brodeur, there was a sequence where I believe Riche shot it in on Richter. Richter makes a save. The net's open because Richter's out of position. Ken Danicos talked about this. He's on the bench. He puts his arms up because there's a few devils in front of the net. And he's thinking, we're going to get a rebound. We're going to score. We're going to win. The puck, I think, hits Brian Noonan's skate, goes into the corner, and all you hear is Sam Rosen, where's the puck? And a few moments later, the Rangers emerge with it. Glenn Anderson takes a shot. Bukaboom takes a shot, stays in, and Mateau wraps around. And the rest is history. So during your time covering the Rangers, after a few years covering the Devils, you moved on to the Rangers. I mentioned Leach. I mentioned Adam Graves, Mike Richter. You've seen Jaromir Jagr. You've seen Henrik Lundqvist. And of course, you got to see, even though he's at the end of his career, still a productive player, Wayne Gretzky. So, I think we would agree that Jagr has a great personality too, but as far as the most charisma, Messier wins that one as the strongest personality of the bunch. But as far as the players I just mentioned that you've covered, even the ones that maybe weren't there that long and weren't there during the most successful period in franchise history, like Lindros, Bure, and Fleury, and list goes on. What would you say was the most? How would you rank the personalities you covered in that locker room? What was it like being around those guys?
Well, you know what? The 3 years that Wayne was here, were very special. His first year, he had 97 points.
Yep.
He led the league in assists, or tied for the league in assists.
At 72.
Big-time player, had 2 hat tricks in the playoffs. And he actually had a pretty good year his second year too, even though the team was just awful.
He had 90 points.
The third year was a drop off for everybody. But being around Wayne for 3 years, covering Wayne Gretzky for 3 years, and someone I actually had a really good relationship with, was just special. We would talk on the phone, maybe 3-4 nights a week, because he just loved talking about hockey. That was the thing about Wayne. You'd cover practice and wind up just sitting around, or really morning skates or practice at Playland. And there weren't the same number of reporters that would go to that were covering the team. There were only a handful. And there were a lot of times where I was the only one to go to the morning skate. It was not a big deal back then to go to the morning skate. And the reason really was it was convenient for me. It was just so convenient for me. I was the only guy who lived in Westchester who was covering the team. And so for me, it was great. And I went over just because I knew I was going to have the chance to sit down and talk with Wayne. And, he would sit around, and he had obviously friends all over the league. And that's what he would do. He would, on his off time, he would speak to his friends. He had 1,000 rumors. He knew everything that was going on in the league. And you had a group of players who would just hang around in the locker room and just talk hockey. You just sit around for a half hour, 45 minutes. And when he wasn't here very long, Mark Savard was the same kind of way. He loved to talk about hockey. So, you'd have Wayne sitting there, and then when Kevin Stevens came, Kevin Stevens would sit there and you talk about hockey. But being around Wayne was special. I really enjoyed Eric Lindros. I like Eric as a guy. He had a big time first season with the Rangers, and then he had concussion issues again. Very different personality. Richter was great to cover. Leach was not effusive in the locker room, but you knew you were around greatness all the time with Brian. And Jagr is a distinct personality.
Yeah.
Jagr's first year, that 2005, well, it wasn't his first year because he came in the middle of 03, 04. And then in 04, 05, there was no season. And so 05, 06 was his first full year with the Rangers. And they brought in a lot of players from Czech Republic that year. And it was Um, it was a fun team to cover. There was a lot of personality on that team. There was Yager, Darius Kasparaitis was there. It was Lundqvist rookie season. It was a very good team, very popular team. They were expected to finish in the bottom three of the league. They were in first place for almost the entire season. Finally, it slumped toward the end of the year, but made the playoffs. I don't think there was anyone in North America who thought they were going to make the playoffs that year. And so, no, really, they had missed the playoffs 7 straight years.
Yeah.
And, they Yager was there, and they had brought in Martin Straka, and they had
Steve Ruchin.
And right. And Steve Ruchin and actually Kevin Weeks was the backup goalie. And Ruchin had a different personality too. So there was a lot of personality on that team. It was a fun team to cover. But the person I have written more about in my life than anybody else is Lundqvist, obviously, because I covered him for 15 years. And I don't know that I've ever enjoyed a relationship more than the long-term one that I had, that I've had with Lundqvist. And maybe the thing, maybe the thing I think is the coolest thing in my career is the fact that I gave him his nickname,
King
and the King, and it was his. It was like his third or fourth game, but you could tell it was something so special about him, and that I wrote after this game. He is King Henrik. He's King Henrik of Sweden. And it took a while. And for a while, I was the only one calling him the King or King Henrik, King Henrik. But it has become his identity in a lot of ways. And honestly, it's maybe the coolest thing I did in my career.
I miss him so much. I love Igor. And I think Igor is going to be a great goalie for a long time. And Igor, who knows, maybe his legacy surpasses that of Lundqvist or Richter, depending on what not likely. You never know. He's great in his own right, but we'll see what happens with his career. But Hank, man, for me, like I said, I gave you my age earlier, and I gave you when I started watching the team earlier, which was that 05-06 season. That's really my first season that I remember. I didn't see Leach. I didn't see Messier, So for me, Hank, with all due respect to the prior legends that have played for the Rangers and obviously had great careers, he's the greatest Ranger I'll ever see. It's, and it'll always sting me that with the Rangers, at least, maybe he'll have a Ray Bork Colorado moment in Washington, we hope, as we continue to recover from heart surgery. But it'll always bother me, like I imagine it bothered Bruins fans with Ray Bork, that he never got his cup in New York. Came close, so close. But man, you wrote about it in the Post. You called it everything but the cup era. And that's really the best line I've heard to sum up that era of Rangers hockey. But before we move on, though, I will say when I was doing my preparation for this, and I don't want to keep you too long, so we'll wrap up in a bit, because I know you're a busy guy. It's funny, you were ahead of your time there, Larry, because you mentioned the lockout earlier. There's an article that just popped up at random from June of 2002, where you were warning about the possibility of a lockout. And sure enough, that was June of 2002. The Red Wings are just coming off winning another Stanley Cup with that all-star team. And then a couple of years later, there's a lockout, which changed the league in some aspects for the worse, but in some aspects for the better.
I think for the worse. I don't believe in salary caps. I think I believe in a soft cap with a luxury tax. I don't believe in hard caps. I think hard caps punish success and are meant to punish success. And so you can take the position that it's better for small markets. I think leagues are better served when there are super teams. I do. I understand that there's a large block who believes otherwise, and Gary Bettman obviously believes that. But I always think that leagues are better served when there are super teams. I think leagues are better served when big markets are in contention all the time. So I am utterly opposed to a salary cap. But yes, you could see this coming. It was pretty clear to me that there was going to be not only a lockout, but the chance of a canceled season. And you could see that because the NHL had dug in on it. And it was interesting too that the NHL in the years leading up to the lockout and the canceled season, the league had permitted obstruction and interference away from the puck in order to try and level the playing field. So they allowed the Florida Panthers, didn't have a great deal of talent, say in the 96 playoffs, just to lasso Lindros when they played the Flyers and just to lasso Yager when they played the Penguins. And Florida wound up beating both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that year in the playoffs, went to the finals and was swept by Colorado.
Yep.
But that was the league's intention was to allow the lesser teams to obstruct the more skilled teams in order to try and level it. And then, of course, as soon as they were able to get their hard cap, they opened the game up to exhibit skill. And so, and then the NHL will talk about how anyway, it was all propaganda from the NHL, but it's a different game now. I do think the league suffers from the lack of a super team. I do. I think you look at every sport. Listen, I am a very casual NBA fan, and I was a huge NBA fan when I was growing up, and I went to I went to all those Knicks games. I was there when they won in '70. I went to all those games. I was around all the time. I love the Knicks, and I love the NBA. And I still like the NBA, but I just, I don't really have time. I'm not, I'm doing hockey. I'm not going to sit and then watch the NBA.
Right.
But I'll tell you what, a couple of years ago, when Golden State put together its super team, I love watching Golden State.
I mean, they were great. They were great to watch. It was beautiful.
Right. I mean, it's entertaining, marquee guys all over the place. And so my point is, I'm a casual NBA fan, but I was drawn to watching the games because of a super team. I wasn't drawn to watching their games because, I don't know, Memphis, was able to compete. Now I understand for the people in Memphis, or I understand in the NHL for you don't want teams folding. You don't want small markets never having a chance to win. So you build in a luxury tax and you do it that way. There are other ways to do it than having a hard cap. I think dynasties are good for sports, and it may be a minority opinion, but I do believe that dynasties are good for sports.
Didn't mean to cut you off. It does have its drawbacks, in the sense that, like I mentioned, the Rangers had all those big names in the early 2000s and didn't do anything. But then there's the other aspect of it, which was that 2001, 2002 Red Wings team, which, just to read off the names for you folks out there, that team had 10, not counting Scotty Bowman, excuse me, not Stan, that's his son. That was the Hall of Fame coach, of course. These are the Hall of Fame players that were on that team, folks. Igor Larionov. Of course, there was Sergei Fedorov, Luc Robitaille, who was also with the Rangers for a couple of years, Brett Hull, Steve Yzerman, that's 5, Dominic Hasek in net, that's 6. I believe there's Brendan Shanahan as well, that's 7. There is Pavel Datsyuk, who was a rookie on that team, which marks, I think he's in the Hall of Fame. Number 9.
He's not eligible yet.
He's not eligible yet, but he'll be in there. So I've named 7 of them. I'm missing a couple more.
I think Larry Murphy, I believe, right?
No, he wasn't on that 01-02 team. I'm trying to think back. It'll come to me at some point. I've named most of them. Luc Robitaille and Brett Hull were on the 4th line of that team. To show you how good they were. I've named 7, but the last few come to me at some point. That's for later. So, back to you personally. You had the good fortune a couple of years ago of receiving the Elmer Ferguson Award from the Hockey Hall of Fame. And now you are a Hall of Famer. So it has a nice ring to it, I must imagine, when people say Larry Brooks, Hockey Hall of Famer. So when you found out that that you were going to receive this honor, I got to ask you, what were the first thoughts that went through your head?
Well, the first thoughts that went through my head actually were that it was going to be great timing because my grandchildren were old enough to understand it and appreciate it. And I was able to bring them to Toronto for the ceremony. So that really was that was my first thought. I mean, I was very appreciative. Um, it's a great honor to be recognized in the same breath, or and be in the same fraternity as people like Red Fisher, uh, Frank Orr, people I grew up reading and actually then joined when I started writing. These guys were writing. To be able to join the legends of the craft was certainly a huge honor for me. But personally, just being able to share it with my grandchildren was the most satisfying part of it. So yeah, it's great though. I remember when I was up there, we were up there that weekend, and someone came over to me for an autograph. Um, and so I signed my name, and they said, no, you have to put HHOF after it. So, and that I have to tell you then was very cool. Larry Brooks HHOF 18. That's very cool. And I've had some people like send me pucks and things to sign, and they say, look, we always, this one person sent me a puck and said, I have signatures from X number of Hall of Famers. Just make sure you sign it with your year, HHOF. So, so that's, listen, I don't get stopped all that often for autographs. When I do, and you write down the HHOF, it's pretty neat. It is.
I imagine, by the way, the last two Hall of Famers just came to me: Nick Lidstrom and Chris Chelios. Those were the other two that came to mind from that Red Wings team. So you've been at this a long time. This is going to be almost 50 years for you between the front office with the Devils and, of course, writing for the Post in two separate stints. I mean, you're still going strong. How much longer do you see yourself doing this?
I'm not sure. I think I'll listen. I think I'll do it for as long as I feel I have something to add, and for as long as the Post agrees that I have something to add. So I'm not thinking about stepping away at this point. I don't see any reason to. I enjoy it. If I stop enjoying it, then there'll be time to rethink it. But I still get a kick out of it. I still enjoy doing it. I enjoy writing. I enjoy writing about the sport. So I don't. I would say I say it's probably a TBD on when the end is coming. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you still got it. I mean, I don't think a writer really ever loses it, to be honest. And I don't want you to step away. I've been reading you since I was 8 years old, man. So it's 13 years now I've been reading you. I don't want you to step away, and I'm very fortunate to be able to talk with you. So it's been a treat reading you through the years. So I've kept you long enough. It is now time for the concluding segment of this podcast. It is called Rapid Fire. And it's been a great conversation with Larry Brooks. I've had a lot of fun talking with you. I hope you've had a lot of fun as well. It is 5 hit and run questions from me and 5 answers from you. So are you ready?
I am ready.
All right, let's do it. First, if you could describe your career in one word, what would it be and why?
Oh, it's fun. I've had a lot of fun doing it. I need to have fun.
Don't we all?
So I never saw myself doing a 9 to 5 where I have to punch in and punch out. It's just been fun.
Absolutely. It's been a great run and covering a lot of great players, as we've talked about throughout the show. Second, you've been walking into Madison Square Garden for years. I got the chance to go there a few years ago for the first time to see my Knicks, and it was surreal. Favorite thing about the Garden?
Well, my favorite thing about the Garden was when I had season tickets in the blue seats. I was up in 419. This was before they refurbished it at all. So 419 was right behind the net at which the Rangers shot twice, first and third. And I had season tickets from actually the first year the Garden opened. They opened in the middle of the season in 67, 68. And I got season tickets starting in 68, 69, and kept them and actually gave them to my sister when I started writing. Um, and she still has one of them. So I loved, I love the atmosphere of being in the blue seats when I was a fan. That's what I remember. And of course, my earliest experiences with hockey was at the Old Garden, um, which was between 49th and 50th and 8th and ninth. And there I would go to the games. It was an old building, and you could get in on your GO card, your school GO card. And when I started going, you could go to games for 50 cents.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it was, but the balcony was kind of over the ice. So if you weren't in the first or second row, you had to like stand up on the railings, balance yourself on the railings and lean over so you could see the ice. And it's such an alien, it's so alien to the experience now where everything is comfort. And to think that there were people, and it was, both side balconies, you'd have people like balancing on the rails between the rows, looking over. And that was great. I was going to games. I started going to games when I was like 5 or 6 years old. And I went with my father, of course. Then I started going myself when I was about 12 or 11 or 12, and go with friends. And that was just a kick to sit in the side balcony and for 50 cents on the GO card, leaning over. But so my experiences as a fan probably are what are most memorable to me at the Garden. Although the noise at the '79 series against the Islanders blew the roof off, not literally. And then, of course, the noise in '94 against the Devils and against Vancouver in the finals.
Absolutely, I imagine, and what were definitely legendary series. So third, Rangers fans, it's been a love-hate relationship through the years with Rangers fans. Most of us, like myself, we enjoy it, but they're a passionate bunch, shall we say. Favorite thing, if you will, about Rangers fans?
Well, my favorite thing about Ranger fans is the fact that I can get two emails on the same day, one telling me I'm a homer and the other telling me I hate the team.
Uh,
So that's my favorite thing about Ranger fans.
yes, they are. And I think all New York sports fans, no matter the team, are definitely a passionate bunch. Fourth, if not for hockey, what sport would you have loved to have covered?
Oh, baseball. Oh, for sure, baseball. I've done a lot of baseball. I did a lot of the Yankees in '77.
Wow.
The Reggie
Billy Martin.
Billy George year. I covered them a lot in '78 until there was a newspaper strike. I was with them a lot in '79, and in fact, uh, covered Thurman Munson's funeral.
Wow.
I had been on the road trip before then, and I did a lot of baseball in '80 and '81. I did a lot, and now I do columns over the summers. I do maybe 2 or 3 columns a week on baseball. Whichever team is home. I enjoy writing about baseball a lot. So, in fact, back in '81, I'd done a lot of baseball in '81, and had I wanted to, the opportunity would have been there for me to move over to baseball. But my son was 1 at the time, and there's just too much. You're on the road, for weeks at a time,
Right.
and for my lifestyle, it just didn't work at the time. Had in '76 baseball been offered to me, I'm sure I would have been a baseball lifer, because I enjoy being at the ballpark. I enjoy writing about these guys. I enjoy writing about baseball too.
I had Ken Davidoff on the show a couple of weeks ago, your colleague over at the Post. Great
Mhm.
guy, and he was a lot of fun to talk to. And he got,
Yeah.
I was picking his brain and he was laughing at a few of my questions, not in a bad way, but, because I was so passionate about it, because he got to cover the Yankees during that dynasty period of 1996
Mhm.
to 2000, and he was covering the 2001 World Series, and he was there for all these, like Clemens, Piazza. So
Right.
it really is a terrific sport. Well, they're all terrific sports, but baseball takes the cake. So fifth and finally, and then we'll plug ourselves and get out of here. What advice would you give a young sports writer or somebody looking to get into the sports business?
Uh, Find a way to be distinctive and find a way to be unique, because the internet has opened this up to any aspiring individual who wants to do this. But you have to be able to create either content or a buzz that differentiates you from everyone else in the universe. You have to be willing to work very hard. There's no question about it. Listen, this is a great job, but it's still a job, and
Right.
it's not as if you just show up and watch a game and just bat out whatever your thoughts are. There is a discipline to it. You're meeting deadlines. You're meeting requirements every week. You have to be prepared. You need to, and of course there's a difference now, because now people can cover. I'm talking about pre-COVID. People can cover teams without ever going to the arena, ever going to the ballpark. So you may not have to learn how to cover a beat. Covering a beat is difficult, because you're always walking the line between, you want access, you want to have a good relationship with the people you're covering, because a good relationship leads to a better flow of information. But you have to be honest too. You have to cover the team.
Right.
So, and then you have to develop, you have to develop the way to criticize a player one day and then walk into the room and deal with him the next day. Now, not everyone does that, because, with bloggers who don't have any access to the team, they don't have to do that. So they can just take shots at guys and write whatever without any repercussions. But it is an industry in which it is imperative that you work hard and put in the preparation and have the discipline. It's not a hobby. If you're going to make it a career, it's a vocation, and it demands time and attention. So, that's I would say that's what you have to be prepared for. But in order to get the shot, differentiate yourself.
And that is sage advice from Hockey Hall of Famer Larry Brooks. So, Larry, it's been incredible getting a chance to talk with you. I was very excited. We were originally going to do this Monday, but things happened, and they were here Friday instead. So I'm glad, nonetheless, that we got this, and it's just really cool for me to be able to talk with you. And thank you for coming on. Before we go, let's plug ourselves. I think the people know where to find you, but in the event that they don't, where are you? Where can we find you?
Well, I am at nypost.com, and the Twitter handle is NYP_Brooksy, BROOKSIE, at NYP. Yeah, that's it, I think. Yeah,
and of course, yeah. And you can find Larry's Slapshots column in the Post as well.
Right.
And so I'll plug myself. If you don't know where to find this podcast, if you're listening because you love Larry and you're hearing this podcast for the first time, please subscribe. I'd love to have you. Leave a 5-star rate review anywhere that you get your podcasts is where this podcast is, including now on YouTube on my MC's Audio YouTube channel. MC_S Audio is where you can find the video version of this podcast. If you like watching podcasts that way, as opposed to the audio version. I'm on LinkedIn at Mike Cologne. Just type in Mike Cologne, Mike to New Haven, MIC_D in New Haven, which is the name of this podcast, of course. And you can find me there and connect, and I'd love to have you on. We do a mixture of things here. We talk with members of law enforcement, the fire service, sports, and news. So we do it all here in the Mike to New Haven podcast. I'm on Twitter at Mike in New Haven, MIKE, which is my first name, IN, and then New Haven. You should know how to spell that. The pizza capital of the world, where I'll be posting this episode and all my other musings for you to see. So again, great chat with Larry Brooks. Please stick around, as I'll be having Detective Bill Ryan on Monday and Dan McNally on Tuesday. And also former WNBC weatherman Chris Cimino is coming up March 8th, and more guests along the way. So this has been a lot of fun. And on behalf of Hockey Hall of Famer Larry Brooks, I'm Mike Cologne, and we will see you next time.